You hear it? Put it out. I don't think so. I can ask you something. I think it's higher and it's on the way from what we Yes.
It's a long today. Well, that's it. Guys, we're going to sit around. It's not good to me. Easier for them to interact. Sure.
Ah, there you go.
It's a normal. Everything.
Yeah.
We all set? We started ready.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this extraordinary session of the Legal Center. And it's an extraordinary session not only because we're doing this out of our regular time, but we have an extraordinary speaker today. I'll introduce him in a moment. But the topic that we're addressing, public crisis or public opportunities, navigating the globalization recession, couldn't be more timely. For those of you who have been following discussions since Davos, public crisis has become a buzzword. And we had the opportunity to discuss this particular topic with someone who has been at the center of several of conversations all over the world that have been related to today's discussion. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Marcos Grego, and welcome him back to Columbia. Professor Grego was the director of Rick Labs here several years ago, still connected and part of an active member of our community. Currently, he is a transformational leadership fellow at the Bethany School of Government at Oxford, and distinguished fellow at the INSEAD's Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society. A former Deputy Economy Minister of Brazil and Special Secretary of Foreign Trade and International Affairs. Professor Grego was, until recently, president of the New Development. And I know that several of you are interested in this particular topic, so I think it's a privilege that for us to be here and have Marcos with us. I mentioned that the topic of public crisis was widely discussed in Davos this year, and Professor Grego is a member actually of the Forum's Global Future Council on Responsive Financial Systems. But some of his most impressive credentials are first, the fact that he was the first Westerner to have a multilateral organization headquartered in Asia. He's also the first Brazilian president to have a multilateral bank. And last but not least, he's the first civil faculty to lead a multilateral organization. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Marcos Grego back in this classroom and back at Columbia. Thanks so much, Marcos.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be here. As Sydney was going over so many things of the past, One thing that I tried to reconnect was the first time I was ever at Columbia. And I was an exchange student in the US when I was 15 years old. That was back in 1982. And I lived in the city in between New York City and Albany, the capital of the state. And I remember one day that my American sister took me to a day out in town in New York. So two things we did, actually three things. The first one is we went to United Nations headquarters. And I was left in the impression, my God, if you really a diplomat, as opposed to here, it should be like, if you're an actor and you're on a play on Broadway, you're an actor, probably film. Then that's the first day I ate oysters in her life because she's thinking the oyster bar again, Grand Central Station. And then she mentioned an institution in New York, and I remember she said something about Ivy League. It was an Ivy, something I did not understand at the time. So I would take you to an Ivy League institution, and then she brought me there to campus. It's a long library. And I remember learning at the time that the Roman Pantheon is actually the source of inspiration for the architects that put together the library. So I have many emotional connections because later I did my postdoc here. The professional fish logos was 2005, 2006. And then I went on to become part of the adjunct faculty teaching here of course. It was first offered in 2011 called the Rise of Business. Then we, of course, adapted into how the rising power have been shaping. But anyway, so Sydney was mentioning that the title of the session is called Crisis, Poverty Opportunities, right? And he mentioned the year 2022 as being, say, the typical critical year because of how confidence the very dangerous drivers all come together. Actually, it was not Adam Tooze. Many people credit Adam Tooze with the expression of crisis. It was in Gabon in the 1990s, and in the context of Rio de Janeiro hosting the United Nations Conference on Sustainable on the Environment and Development, where he said that many different ecology-related crises are coming together, and therefore public crisis is first thought of in a context of sustainability. But obviously, the concept has been expanded. And if you look out there, you say, well, maybe we are in the political conjuncture because you have the most delicate geopolitical scenario since the World War II in the heart of Europe and in the Middle East. You have still the fallout effects of the most serious health-related crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. You have the highest levels of inflation since the stagflation wave of the 70s and the 80s. For you to have an idea, out of $6 in circulation in the world today, one simply did not exist 18 months ago. So major expansion of the monetary base, hand in hand with its twin sister, which is fiscal largesse. So a number of things that we might consider coming together to exponentiate the effect of the other day, I'm living in São Paulo. The other day I was in my apartment in São Paulo, which is not very far from the so-called Ibirapuera Park. It's like the Central Park in Shanghai. And this is very great urban metropolis, but as a miracle, some very beautiful birds were just sitting out the windows. I said, I'm going to take a picture. Took the picture out. I took my phone out to take a picture. And because the park in São Paulo is also close to the city airport, the moment the picture was taken, portrays the four birds closer to the camera lens. But there is an airplane taking off in the background, right? So there are five things, you see these four beautiful birds, and you see the airport taking off in the background. And because of the optical illusion of proximity, you may say, well, birds are bigger objects than planes. But actually, the plane taking off is a much more robust object than the plane. So, as we describe public crisis once again, COVID-19 has not an effect that is playing out in the world today, but something that we're going to have with us for a long time. Stagflation, or the new normal of inflationary pressures followed by growth. Geopolitics being rerouted into becoming perhaps I wouldn't like to say that, a very dangerous situation that is having more and more people talk about it in possible World War III. And the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, seem to be capturing the attention of us for the cycle of 24-hour news and for what we need to do. But it is my impression that if we take a larger arc of history and we sort of try to calibrate our crystal balls into what we can consider 25 years, so we're talking about 8th century. There are 4 other drivers that I want to share with you, because in my opinion, there will be more consequential to Latin America as a whole than particularly to Venezuela. These are not necessarily things that I agree with or disagree with, or that I have an opinion on, because I've tried to stay with most of those factors. And they will bring about risks and opportunities for Latin America. So the first one is, today is the 1st of November, 2023, right? Today the global population is 8 billion. When we meet again in this room in 2040, so that's 25 years ago, the world population will have moved from the current 8 billion people to 10 billion. There's going to be a net expansion of 2 billion in the world population over the course of the next year. My question to you, do you know how long it will take for the world population to reach 2 billion? So there was this guy who was the chief economist of the OECD, British economist, very ambitious, this historian, economist, who worked with sophisticated statistics. And he argues that the world population near Jesus is 100. And the moment the world population reaches 2,150 million people, we are in the year 1920. So we took the world 1,925 years to reach the mark of 2 billion. So in the next quarter century, in the next 25 years, we'll add to the global population something that in the past it took humanity 1,900. Well, if you go down to First Avenue and 46th Street and looking at the United Nations, you see a number of flags, and the number of flags standing for the countries that are members of the international. I think there's 193 today. So this expansion of 2 billion people that we're going to be eyewitnesses to this next 25 years will only come from 9 countries. So there's going to be a net populational decline in 184 countries, and there's a net population increase in 9. India, Pakistan, there's going to be a marginal increase in the United States, and all of the other 6 countries are from sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, and I forgot. But this is what's happening.
How about Kenya? Maybe Kenya?
Maybe Kenya, but it's a possibility.
Yeah.
So you know what that represents? Basically, I don't know if you remember this, foolish but entertaining Hollywood blockbuster from 20 years ago called Independence Day, in which planet Earth is invaded by forces from outer space, and they're all very maligned, right? And you have this big battle spaceships destroying the most iconic architectural constructions of the world. So in the next 25 years, this 2 billion people population expansion is equivalent to one of the spaceships bringing in another Russia, 100, another United States, 350 million people, and another China, 1.5. One of the very basic questions we could ask is, where is the world's food going to come from? Where is the world's water going to come from? Where is the world's energy going to come from? How will this impact in terms of accelerating or slowing down the so-called transition to the green economy? Now let us associate this one driver to a second driver, which is also something that's unfolding before our eyes. Today, if you take into account the so-called G7, right, the group that's been meeting since the second half of the 1970s, the US, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada. These 7 countries today have a combined gross domestic product measured at purchasing power their terms of $48 trillion. That's the combined 7. Whereas if you take into account what I like to call the E7, the biggest emerging economy in the world, in China, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, they already have combined GDP. Once again, imagine that purchasing power in terms of 58. So in GDP terms, today the E7 is about 20% bigger than the G7. And then you may say, well, that happens because of the oversized role of China in the emerging world. But the truth is, if you take China away from the E7, or you take the United States away from the G7, in purchasing power pair terms, the E6 is bigger than the G6, which tells you that this is quite a long way from understanding the Soviet balance. So that creates about very interesting scenarios. Because, for example, let us look at GDP now. Right, so the biggest GDP in the world, it's 24 trillion. Second, China, 19 trillion. What's the third? Japan, 5.5. Now, many people say that China is stagnating. The growth rates are not as robust as they were back in the 2000s, when China was growing at 12% a year. Now China is expanding at 4.5%, 5%. But people forget that size back. Because let us suppose that China's rate of GDP increase for the next 10 years stabilizes at around 4%. So 4% out of a $19 trillion economy represents a marginal yearly contribution to information for men of $760 billion a year, which means that if China this year, 2023 alone, grows at 4%, it's adding one Argentina 0.5 to the global economy over the 12 months. So that's essentially one Argentina every 8 years. And if you look at a 10-year horizon, you may say, well, what is the biggest economy of the world going to be in 2033? Once again, if growth rate stabilizes China at 4%, the biggest economy of the world in 2033 will be either China or the US. The second biggest economy of the world will be either China or the US. But the third biggest economy of the world will be a China that does not exist today. But that will be created as a result of the market expansion of China's next. Now, one of the things I find fascinating about this phenomenon, and one that will have a formidable impact in the economy of Latin America, and particularly that of Brazil, relates to By the way, over the past 18 months, I was twice at the World Economic Forum. I was at the spring and the fall meetings of the International Monetary Fund. I was in Glasgow for the top. I was in Sharm el Sheikh for the top. And these two words seem to be everywhere. Food, it's only, it's everywhere. Let's look at a country like India, right? Because if you take the past 10 years that are contemporary to the presence of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in power, India has had a GDP expansion of 7.3%, right? Average in 10 years. And once again, you're looking at a crystal ball, you look at the next 10 years, it's not going to be much different. India will go on expanding at 7% a year every year for the next 10 years. So mathematicians have taught us a very interesting magical trick, which is called the rule of sevens. So imagine, for example, you want to gauge how long it takes for a country to double its income per capita based upon its annual rate of expansion. So in 70 divided by 7, 10. So 10 is the number of years per year for India to double its income. Right? Now, what is India's income per capita today, give or take? $3,000. Do you know what is it that happens to the additional income that's generated in terms of its destination when a country grows so much from such a low income per capita base at such a short period of time, only 10 years? You know what people do? People eat. At first, it's a calorie revolution, and subsequently, it's a nutritional revolution. Eat better, eat more. By the way, a number of things. Right? Eat more, eat better, you build more infrastructure, you consume more energy. But it's a very different phenomenon than what you would experience if you're a country like Norway and you double your income per capita, because the destination of the increment we can go to buying a second home, to buying a beach house in Spain, having plastic surgery. So this is what you do with your increment of income when you're already sitting at $89,000. But if you're at 3%, if you're at 3,000 and you're doubling your income per capita in the short graph of half a generation, people are going to eat. But once again, you ask the question, take into account the 1.5 million Chinese, the 270 million Indonesians, 110 million Egyptians and Vietnamese. And you ask the question, where is the most? Well, what are the top 4 food producers? Number 1 is China. Because of China's relative size and its impressive economic ascension over the past 45 years. China is a net importer of food. The number 2 producer in the world is the United States, with the limitations that we are all aware of. The 3rd producer is India. And India has reached that position fueled by a completely, as I see, suboptimal agricultural production, because it's very much based upon the so-called agricultural subsistence with very effective use of inputs, and particularly the use of water. Out of 10 liters of water that are consumed in India every day, 8.5 go to agriculture. So for the household, for industrial use, for sanitation, you only have about 1.5 liters of water. It's very ineffective use of water. Not to mention that if you take into account the relative price of food in India to GDP per capita, food in India is enormous. By the way, at one particular point, I was the trade secretary, and I went to India to try to open India's markets, exports. India's agricultural markets make Europeans look like Adam Smith enthusiasts. Right? right? And at the end of my talk, there's this Indian professor of INSEAD, great guy. He came over to me and said, congratulations, I did everything you said. I am sure that if we open up our markets very soon, Brazil and India will be the biggest water trade. And I consider myself to be someone who's relatively familiarized with different trades, lexicon, and I went to that's exactly what he does. For example, you know why that China produces so much corn domestically, but imports so much soybeans abroad?
What consumption?
For you to produce 1 ton of soybeans, you need about 5 times the amount of water you need to produce 1 ton of corn. So you may think that you're exporting soybeans, but in reality, you are exporting water. And this is perhaps one of the greatest credentials that Latin America has, in particular in countries like Brazil, because not only do we have the most important water reserves in the world, but they're sustainable and they are recyclable. In Brazil, you have the so-called flying rivers, right? The amount of rain incidence across the country and throughout the year as a result of those ecosystems. The third driver, my friends, is, and I'm sure you can see that, view that. There was a rerouting of global value chains. Rerouting. By the way, I don't like value chains. I like value networks better because it's a phenomenon that expands far beyond the realm of supply. It also affects the demand. Because one of the extraordinary consequences of the rise of the emerging world and the rise of Asia is that it changes how trade and investment geometries are delineated. For example, back in 2001, China-Brazil trade was $1 billion. Today, China-Brazil trade is $1 billion every 60 hours. Okay? Every 60 hours. So 4 years ago, some people in Brazil celebrated the fact that Brazil approved food security reform, right? Pharmacovigilance. And the economy minister of Brazil at the time said, "Oh, we're saving $1 trillion in expenses in a space of 10 years because there's $1 trillion reais because of the reform that. So $1 trillion can get about $200 billion. Brazil is exporting $100 billion to China every 12 months. So the macroeconomic effect of this is only in exports to China, Brazil has one macroeconomic equivalent of a social security reform difference. The impacts are massive. I don't know how many of you follow Robin British on Twitter. You know the IIF economist. So he has a thing or two to say about Brazil's trade profile and trade surplus and how it brings about benign macroeconomic effects as a result of the new trade connections between Brazil and China. But anyway, there is a rerouting of global value chains. And this is happening because geopolitics. It's happening because politics. There are more restrictions to trade for geopolitical reasons than you had 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's a phenomenon that I'm calling geoeconomic security. And there are a couple of very good sources that you can access to learn more about geoeconomic security. One of them is the speech by the current National Security Advisor of the White House, Jake Sullivan, who also happens to be the author of the public article for this latest issue of Foreign Affairs about security being there, having driver's seat when it comes to making economic decisions. Well, even turning that the new Washington consensus. And we've gotten used to a Washington consensus that, as far as the International Division of Labor or global value chains are concerned, were very well described by Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, which I think appeared 18 years ago. Well, volleyball would be designed in Germany. The artificial leather came from Malaysia, I believe from Thailand. The ball was put together in China. Then it's shipped somewhere else by a Norwegian company. The accounting is taken care of by someone in Ireland. The advertising agency that puts together the global marketing campaigns from Brazil. So nominally, you can read on the ball made in China, but it's pretty much made in the world, right? So we are no longer living in that. The world that I have just described does not exist, in at least in the architecture that I have outlined. Because one, China is no longer a low-cost country. China today has a GDP per capita, even in nominal terms, is 50% bigger than that of Israel. But also because this rerouting of networks is following other kinds of GPS. For example, an important portion of the manufacturing hubs that were housed in China are being relocated to countries like India, where the labor supply is very big, where you have a managerial quote unquote class that's that's very competent, where you have frugal innovation and easy access to technology. This relocation is also happening towards Mexico. And many people say this is happening because of nearshoring, right? And it seems to me that there is a basic mistake in the concept of nearshoring, because you may think that near in this particular context means something that is geographically close to your market application. When in reality, we should understand nearshoring as those countries that have the combination of trade and investment agreements, logistical capabilities, and the embrace of standards that makes it easier for them to be accepted into the markets. So it's more nearshoring, and friendshoring is more about what kind of ease to do business environment you have at home than by physical proximity. And then the fourth characteristic, my friend, the one that I had the opportunity to do on my own famous, both in government and health constitution, is that the very concept of infrastructure is changing. There is a kind of metamorphosis of infrastructure, because we used to approach this issue as infrastructure being either physical, tangible, or digital. Bridges, railroads, airplanes, warehouse. That's the physical side. And then you have connectivity, kind of Wi-Fi and everything else. I believe that this separation of the physical and the digital, when it comes to thinking about infrastructure, no longer makes sense. The infrastructure is either smart or it's outdated. So if you are out there in a development institution, or you are a public policy official, you're allocating budget, for example, for educational infrastructure, and you think it's school building. So the school building itself cannot be conceptualized unless it has the necessary connectivity, devices. In the case, in-person classes are not possible because there's a COVID, and the in-person interaction between teachers and students is not feasible, that at least some kind of virtual classes, virtual interactions. So it's not only about the physical building, but it's also about the connectivity. And one is not, it's not separated from it. Everything is embedded together. We're talking about smart infrastructure. I remember back in 2020, for example, having this wonderful conversation with a prominent social scientist. And he was telling me, Mark, is the most, I would ask people, what is the most important infrastructure challenge that you have out there? And he said, well, as we go through the hard days of COVID, there is 500 million people in 500 million children in the world today under the age of 12 who are not having in-person classes, and they cannot have remote because there is no connectivity associated with them. So in short, I would say that the way of looking at the glass and seeing it half full, which is the reverse side of the crisis, quality opportunities, creates a pretty positive scenario for Brazil. It is as if Brazil was playing cards around the table, and all of a sudden someone walks into the room and says, ladies and gentlemen, I've just received information that there's going to be an earthquake 5 minutes from now. He's coming from the bunker. Go out to the bunker, but you love playing cards, you get back to the table and the cards are all mixed up. So everything has to be reshuffled and the game has to be distributed again. When the game is distributed, a country like looks at the cards and says, you know what? I have we can't. But since we are in Latin America, Studies Institute, let me quote someone from Spain. Ortega said, because you say, yo soy yo, he means I am myself and my circumstances. The circumstances may be very good for Brazil, for other South America, or even Latin American countries. It's going to take a lot of inner workings to extract as much benefits as possible from this scenario.
Thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, I'm probably happy to get to block sharp, but we're gonna have quite time for a few questions. So start thinking about the question Nate. And to kick off the discussion, Marcus, I think that's a very good point. Then with challenges come opportunities. One thing that we over and over Brazil is that Brazil is a country that doesn't miss an opportunity to miss opportunities. How can we make sure that that doesn't happen this time?
I don't know. A good slide is about the quality of our practice. The atmospheric conditions and improve the pilot connection with the power control. You might ask whether we have all that. I don't know. I mean, what I can say is the worst case scenario for Brazil compared to the worst case scenario for other emerging markets, it's not that bad. Because Brazil's traditional Ricardian comparative advantages in agriculture and food production in an energy multi matrix mix, and this all-encompassing attention the world now has for transitioning towards the green economy will keep Brazil from the least desired. The problem is, without strategy, without structural reforms, the best case scenario might equal the worst case.
All right, so let's for like a few questions here. Why don't start on this side and then go around.
I want to know how you think these relations will change with this member coming to yes, the expansion of
I'm sorry, we can take this. I'll do that.
No, I'm going to spend 40 minutes only.
Okay.
No, not very. Otherwise, I'll go one by one. Try to be short. So,
Right.
BRICS is entering a third age, right? So there's a first stage of BRICS, which is Gino O'Neill, the guy who's in Goldman Sachs, is looking at the future of the global economy. Looks at 2030 and says, well, you know what? Brazil, Russia, India, and China are going to have a bigger and bigger slice of the global economy. We should place our bets on these four countries. They're going to be agents of global economy. we're 7 years away. From 2030, I think that he was mostly flying. China and India. And less so when it comes to Russia and Brazil. So BRICS 1.0 is about how the future of the global economy is going, right? So this is BRICS 1.0. But then at one particular point, representatives of these four countries, plus a representative from the African continent, they start gathering at the levels of heads of government, heads of ministries of finance, of foreign affairs, and so on. And as well, instead of being defined from the outside, let us define what BRICS is about. Let us put together a platform for exchanges, cooperation. Let us eventually put together institutions like, for example, the New Development Bank, right? So this platform for cooperation and dialogue and eventual institutional building is BRICS 2.0. Yeah. Now, what's going to come out of the South Africa summit this year is a question. I don't know. Some people rush to say that there's an anti-West alliance being shaped. But you see, if you think of a country like China, right? China-US trade had the most, had the biggest trade levels in terms of exports plus imports ever in 2020, in 2022. What is the top destination for Chinese FDI over the past 20 years? The United States. What is the top destination for US FDI over the past 20 years? It's China. And if you look at the China European relations, it's pretty much the same. So the level of interdependence that you see here from one of the top players in BRICS, which is China, and other parts of the West, tell you that you are in a very different place than what would be a Cold War 2.0. I remember speaking a couple of years ago with Rahul Hasham, the guy who was chief economist of the IMF, and then later president of the Central Bank of India. And he was telling me that he did a study on USSR trade relations. And then he was bringing the volumes of trade updated into monetary expressions that are contemporary. He said, well, the year in which the USSR traded the most was 1979, 1 year before the boycott of the Moscow Olympics. And trade that year was $2 billion. So today, China-US trade is $2 billion a day. So the interdependence is there. There might be forces in BRICS that would like to see the alliance or platform that's more political or more anti-Western than it may sound. But once again, there's a Western country. What perhaps I find it more difficult to understand. I understand there's some geographical representativeness that you want to input in the expansion of BRICS as a concept. I mean, Ethiopia is a country of 1,000 per year, not a major economic power. It has had in the past geopolitical differences with Egypt, which is another member now of the platform. You have Iran, which is the most sanctioned country in the world, along with North Korea and Russia. And then you have two oil-rich countries. So let us see. I think it's an open question. Hopefully, it will become constructive policy.
That's the point of the climate crisis specifically. What do you think this is more in fighting this global climate crisis, and what are the, from a perspective of being involved in this platform and academia, what's the perspective of the policies? How can they actually pass policies within the government to actually move to a green economy?
I think it's a combination of being a good role model to making sure that international org that moves on defined multilateral. I've had many interactions with India, and China, this and that's 3-4 years. And one thing that I want to be absolutely certain is that the template of the past in which this rule of this concepts were defined of only a handful of nations. And they were presented as a kind of take it or leave it proposal for other countries to simply endorse. That's not. So it has to be more universally drafted so that it can be more universally endorsed, right? Although, for example, the family of documents that relate from the Paris trajectory is a very good one. That said, I mean, if something that has to be reborn from a Brazilian perspective is sharing some of this tech-intensive experience, for example, in the biofuel. It's been now more than 40 years. Brazil has had a functional alternative biofuel related to oil. And I think the truth is something that is attracting a lot of attention. And then there's this new wave of FDI. It's more abundant than I think. For us, green hydrogen objectives. Right? So if Brazil can put its, let's say, behavior where its mouth is and becoming a good role model for this multi-mix combination of energy sources that are climate friendly, plus its role as a diplomatic actor in making sure that the climate agenda is multilateral, and perhaps I think Brazil there as not only the moral power, but the objective characteristics given its ecological credentials to play that role. I think that's one position.
So you mentioned the idea of reforms and strategy. Brazil needs to actually realize the opportunities that you described. What would be, if you could give maybe top 3 policy reforms structural in Brazil?
What's your name?
Sam.
It's funny. Let me do something that's academically a little irresponsible, but on the other hand, something that makes it more clear from public policy. If you look into every single economic miracle since 1955, there is some degree of combination between institutional economics or the relevance of institutions for economic performance and the role of strategy. And it is as if there was a ruler, right? And then you have a vehicle that travels across this ruler. And you will see that some countries adopt more institutional frameworks, whereas others don't necessarily reform their institutions, but they have very good strategy. So if you look at a country like China, very clearly, there's a very strong emphasis on strategy. 1949, 1978, China's economic performance was not that impressive. 1978 all the way to today, there was a change of course. There's another strategy on the table. It worked very well for them. Did institutions say modernize, change a lot? The strategy when compared 1949, 1970, 1970, they changed. In the case of Brazil, there was a lot of good institutional change, especially since 1985. The country has no strategy, right? This Brazil want from China. What's Brazil want from the US moving forward the next 10 years? Why was it that Brazil's as the biggest economy in Mercosur took more than 20 years to conclude a trade and investment agreement with the European Union, which as a whole is still the biggest economy of the world? Brazil lacks a strategy. On the other hand, when it comes to reforms, don't have to give them 3 or 4, I'll give you 1. Which is very effective. And then it sits in the heart of Brazil's lack of competitiveness, just act like. You know what tax burden is the percentage of GDP in Brazil? 35%. You know what tax burden as a percentage of GDP in China? According to these solutions, 21%. You know what's tax burden as a percentage of GDP in India? 18%. Across the EMDCs, emerging market and developing countries, right? The average tax burden as a percentage of GDP is 20%. So let us suppose that what I said is right in terms of manufacturing hubs, industrial networks, and value chains being redrafted and rerouted to Brazil. Without doing something about not only the amount of wealth that goes into paying taxes every year, but the ease to comply with your tax responsibilities in Brazil. If it's not made easier, then Brazil is not going to be able to once again extract as much benefits as and it's not only tax reform in itself, because let us take into consideration another very visible element of competitiveness into 21st century, which is the capacity to innovate. And the capacity to innovate has many functions, but one of them is what is the amount of resources that's the percentage of your GDP that you direct to research. Right? So, as I graduated from college and was admitted into diplomatic service back in 1991, I went straight to working at the Science and Technology Division of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the time, Brazil was investing 1% of its GDP in research. China was investing 0.2%. Today, 2022, 2023, Brazil invests the very same 1% of its GDP in R&D&I, whereas China is converging to the average of what OECD countries dedicate to research development and innovation. Now, imagine, for example, you just travel half the way in between the 35% of tax burden as a percentage of GDP and 20%, which is the average of emerging markets. And that because of tax reform, you have more people paying taxes in Brazil. Because you have more people paying taxes in Brazil, the amount of taxes that each person, be it a corporate or individual pays, is less. And you simplify the rules at the same time. All of these amount of resources that will be liberated will, for example, be available for entrepreneurs and firms and knowledge institutions to be transformed into R&D resources, which are the bedrock. I think that's good. So once again, a marriage between strategy and structural reforms, the most important one at present being tax reform. And I think, at least as I see Brazil and think about its future, it's very important not to walk back on reform and reform independence of the central bank. How public enterprise can invest in sanitation, which includes also of legislation adopted in 2020.
I was curious specifically about Brazil's agriculture sector. Given that he talks about like how favorable trade policies can facilitate trade, and global markets are doing it with environmental regulations. I'm curious how you sort of evaluate Brazil's reliance on its agricultural sector for economic growth, given that growing environmental concerns might present some challenges to the growth of that sector, the success of the sector, the cost of finance provisions.
Just a question for you all in connection with this, taking a broader scope. What country in the world is the #1 producer of commodities? Not only agricultural commodities, but energy commodities, mineral commodities. #1. What is the #1 country when it comes to the production of commodities?
China.
China? No. Australia? No.
US.
It's the United States. It's absolutely compatible. Absolutely compatible to be a giant. And that's pretty,
Well, that's one like that.
well, commodities in terms of, for example. The economic criteria thing are mostly bought and sold, and that you're not a price maker, you're a price taker. Of course, the recent drive of the US was also very much powered by the US becoming the number one oil producer. But my point was, you see, it's been almost like a second nature to academic thinking to say that if you are a protagonist in the sphere of commodities, then as a consequence, you are destined to become the producer of low tech goods. And that the future is in high tech goods, and therefore commodities are more of a curse than a witness. And I do not accept this. But going back to the issue of agriculture in Brazil, and it's actually Brazil has agreed to most of the things that are there in the Paris Agreement. I was one of the chief negotiators of the given the electoral cycles in Brazil, one particular point, I believe the European side thought they had some sort of leeway to perhaps reopen the discussions to more things that would make sense to domestic audiences and constituencies in Europe. And that's where we are right now, that particular state. It's one of the most sustainable agricultural. We shouldn't buy face value someone's protectionist rhetoric using God in the market. Great Brazilian diplomat tried it out. He used to say that in the early 2000s, it was cheaper for a Brazilian for a French supermarket to fly a cow first and last from São Paulo to Paris, and then to actually have the French government subsidize the production of that cow.
Sorry, unfortunately, we have only 2 minutes, and we have to switch to another class. I know that some of you are taking class with my secretary, but we always dedicate a couple of minutes to good class. Not as good as our speaker here, but the reason that we're not taking a lot of questions is because we always dedicate some time to talk about careers in professional development, and we cannot miss the opportunity to hear from someone that includes career, and a lot of people would like to benefit. So Marcos, how do you create opportunities to access things that you've done so much in your own life, professional life? So you've been a career diplomat, you've been in government, you led an international organization, you worked in the private sector. It's fascinating that you cannot get so many different contexts. It's something that a lot of us aspire to.
It's not an easy question to answer. I think in the 1980s, for example, there was a concept that was very much involved in called reverse engineering. I think going forward, especially in the field of international affairs, you have something that can be called reverse talent. Reverse talent. I love to study the origin of words. Yeah, what talent means? It means inclination. So, for example, if you're inclined to do one particular thing, for example, you have an inclination for negotiation, right? Make sure that you're able to answer the question, what is it that I can do besides what I am already doing? So make sure that you throw in some capacity to interpret quantitative things. Right? Or, for example, if you want to do international statistics, make sure that you have the ability to present those them in an intelligible manner without necessarily a PowerPoint presentation. So the ability to be a multi-tasker is true in advertising, it's true in investment banking. I think it's true more and more in the field of international business, which is the kind of product that's turned out like this. You know what? Just one piece of Do you know why it is? It's, yes.
Because of the war,
Yes,
yeah. After,
more.
I think in my understanding is after the Africa is first of all something that needed professional diplomats to,
For example, who was the commander of the Allied forces on D-Day, 6 June 1940? What was the name of the general?
Eisenhower.
Or who was elected president of the United States? He was president from a particular point in the 50s all the way to any moment in the White House, which I can't remember. What was the name of this guy?
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower. What did he do in the meantime? Really bad. President.
Yeah.
And folklore goes that at one particular point, he came to grips with the speech by Churchill in 1946 in Missouri, the famous Iron Curtain speech, in which Churchill was saying, it's no longer Britain that's rule the world, will be the most important advocate of some values like market economy, democracy, rule of law. It's going to be the United States, and then Eisenhower said, well, we have this is one of the legend says second biggest.
Actually, just I really want to share is like I think the de-dollarization is not a magical not, but it's when I really support like the direct settlement. Yes, I really support the direct settlement in policy that one breaks because in my opinion.
Actually, can we, camera so that it means something off the record?
Okay.
And for those of you who are online,